Welcome to today's lesson on assessing the correlation between body mass and the risk of type 2 diabetes. In our roadmap for today, we will start by discussing how BMI is calculated and what it tells us about a person's body mass. Next, we will look at the significance of waist-hip measurements and how they can be used alongside BMI to evaluate the risk of type 2 diabetes. So far, you have learned about how blood glucose levels are controlled. This includes understanding how the body maintains glucose homeostasis through the actions of hormones like insulin and glucagon. You also learned about the two types of diabetes, including type 2 diabetes, where the body cells don't respond to insulin. Building on this foundation, today's lesson will help us investigate how body mass can influence the risk of disorders like type 2 diabetes. By evaluating these risk factors, we can gain insights into the importance of maintaining a healthy body weight and fat distribution for metabolic health. To understand the relationship between body mass and the risk of type 2 diabetes, we first need to explore two important metrics: body mass index, or BMI, and the waist-to-hip ratio. Both of these measurements help identify obesity, a significant risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Body mass index is a calculation that can help indicate if someone is underweight, normal weight, overweight, or obese. The formula for BMI is BMI equals mass divided by height. To calculate BMI, we measure mass in kilograms and then height in meters. We then square the height and divide the mass by the squared height. For example, if an individual weighs 70 kilograms and is 1.75 meters tall, their BMI would be 70 divided by 1.75 squared, which is 22.9. Research has shown that as BMI increases past a certain point, the risk of developing type 2 diabetes significantly increases. This is because higher body fat can lead to insulin resistance, a key factor in type 2 diabetes. The waist-to-hip ratio is another measurement that offers more insight into someone's fat distribution. This ratio compares the circumference of the waist to that of the hips. We can calculate waist-to-hip ratio by first measuring the circumference of the waist just above the navel. Then, measure the circumference of the hips at the widest part. Finally, divide the waist measurement by the hip measurement. For example, if an individual's waist measurement is 80 centimeters and their hip measurement is 100 centimeters, the waist-to-hip ratio would be 80 divided by 100, which equals 0.80. Having a higher waist-to-hip ratio suggests that more fat is stored around the waist, which is a significant risk factor for type 2 diabetes. While BMI and waist-to-hip ratio are useful tools for assessing the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, they are not definitive indicators. These measurements do not account for factors like muscle mass, fat distribution, or individual metabolic health. It's important to consider them as part of a broader assessment that includes other health markers and lifestyle factors. Let's work through some questions to better understand the correlation between body mass and type 2 diabetes using the BMI equation and waist-to-hip measurements. In this first question, a person weighs 80 kilograms and has a height of 1.6 meters. Calculate their BMI. First, recall the BMI equation, which is BMI equals weight divided by height squared. Next, we plug in the values to get BMI equals 80 kilograms divided by 1.6 m squared. When we work out this calculation, we get an answer of 31.25. In our second question, a person has a waist circumference of 88 centimeters and hip circumference of 102 centimeters. We need to calculate their waist-to-hip ratio. We start with the waist-to-hip ratio formula, which is waist-to-hip ratio equals waist circumference divided by hip circumference. We then plug in the values to get the calculation 88 centimeters divided by 102 centimeters. From this, we can work out that their waist-to-hip ratio is 0.86. In today's lesson, we investigated the relationship between body mass and the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, with a focus on body mass index and waist-to-hip measurements as assessment tools. We reviewed the equation for calculating BMI, which is a widely used measure to categorize individuals based on their body mass relative to height. BMI is calculated by dividing a person's weight in kilograms by their height in meters squared. This measure helps to classify individuals into categories such as underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese, each of which can have different implications for health. Furthermore, we explored how waist-to-hip ratio serves as an additional indicator of health risks, particularly those related to cardiovascular diseases and type 2 diabetes. Waist-to-hip ratio is calculated by dividing the circumference of the waist by the circumference of the hips. Unlike BMI, waist-to-hip measurements accounts for fat distribution, highlighting the risk associated with central obesity, which is closely linked to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. We evaluated how both BMI and waist-to-hip ratio are correlated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Individuals with higher BMI and waist-to-hip ratio values are more likely to develop insulin resistance. By understanding these measurements and their implications, students can appreciate the importance of maintaining a healthy body weight and fat distribution to reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes. This knowledge reinforces the significance of a balanced diet and regular physical activity in the prevention and management of diabetes.